Excuse me.
No one's here today.
No one's here yet. We'll see.
So, Rabbi. Oh, no, I'm on YouTube.
Yes, we're on YouTube. Got a few people on YouTube. Got another one coming in through Zoom. Give it a few more minutes for attendance to trickle in. And send the link. Just a second.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem. It's always the same link every week.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it's 7:02. That's still early by usual attendance, although I really want to get cracking in order to see if we can't make it all the way through Eruvin 10 and finish the Masechet tonight. Yay.
No, I was reading a book, and I really liked Rabbi Ishmael, his perspective of Judaism.
Of Rabbi Yishmael?
Yes.
Well, which aspect?
Was it in the book of the sages that I sent you? Remember?
Right.
5 volumes, and now they are talking about the comparison between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, the two biggest schools at the time, before 20, 30 years before the Bar Kokhba revolution.
Right.
And revolt, sorry. And it's very interesting because he was different than Rabbi Akiva completely. He was more human and logic centered, and not so much mystic and messianic like Rabbi Akiva. And everything that all his teaching was centered in what is the Torah say, and not completely out of no place interpretation like Rabbi Akiva, but also using the logic, and everything was centered in the human. Okay, like the Torah was built for the human,
right?
And Rabbi Akiva was more spiritual, more for God and more for the messianic time. And Rabbi Ishmael said, you know what, you need to make in a way that makes sense for us. For example, okay, a good example that I found is that to break the mandament, okay, Rabbi Ishmael said, you know what, life is so important that if you need to break every commandment, just do it, because life is more important, okay?
Right.
Rabbi Akiva said, no, you don't break anything because it's good to die for God. And after that was the compromise, in the Lord compromise that we know today, that you can break everything but 3 things, okay? That was a compromise between the 2 schools. But the perspective of Rabbi Ishmael is very interesting. Now, I also agree many things with Rabbi Akiva, the nationalism, the center of the Jewish people center. Okay, Rabbi Ishmael was more universal.
Right.
Rabbi Akiva was very nationalist. So But it's very interesting, and I think that it's sad that we don't learn so much about Ishmael today.
Rabbi Akiva did end up, his school did end up being the more dominant of the two.
By far.
Yes.
Like you told us always, if you don't have anything that say the source in the Mishnah, is because it's a school of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva. Like Rabbi Meir as a student of Rabbi Akiva. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Rabbi.
Yes.
I had a question though, just out of curiosity, because I've been trying to look up Jewish sociology lately. Are there any comparisons between Maimonides and Mendelssohn? Because Maimonides was obviously a believer in modern Judaism, and his descendants reigned as Nagid for 4 generations. And that with Mendelssohn, that didn't happen. They did not stay on the top of Jewish hierarchy.
So I haven't seen anything specifically on that topic, but I know that many people criticized Mendelssohn's, well, first of all, many people were absolutely astounded by Mendelssohn's mental abilities in both Jewish spheres and outside.
Same as Maimonides, though, right?
What's that?
Rambam was the same way, though. He astounded many people.
Yes, that's my point. There was definitely a similarity of being mentally gifted and brilliant. Both of them did, like you said, a lot to try and help people see that there was a lot of linkage between the science or the thought of their day and Judaism. But Mendelssohn, gets a lot of bad press because eventually, yes, his children did drift away from Judaism. But that does not seem to actually have been inherent within Mendelssohn's own thinking and Mendelssohn's own thought. The idea that somehow Mendelssohn was responsible for that because of his attitude really became a rallying cry as a criticism of the Enlightenment prospects among what would become the Orthodox movement. But like in many cases, their history is not always actual history, but is usually intended to prove their point, regardless of whether it connects to the events that it really did happen. So, yeah, Mendelssohn was a traditional Jew his entire life, and he was committed to all aspects of Rabbinic Judaism his entire life, just like Rambam. And the circumstances that followed after his death were very different than the circumstances that followed after Rambam's death. So it's less to do with the genius or the ability of the two great teachers, and more to do with what happened to the world after they had passed.
But what about within the society? Because we see that in America today quite a bit, which you didn't see in Europe. Well, to the same extent of of people leaving.
Of course you did. There was mass leaving of Judaism in Europe when the Enlightenment began, and more importantly, when the ghetto walls came down.
That's why we have the modern Orthodox as a reaction against Enlightenment.
Right. So it's not as though every Jew who stayed in Europe and didn't come to America wore a black coat and had very long payos and only sat studying the Talmud the whole day. The vast majority of the Jews who lived in Europe, East and West, were relatively modern in their outlook. One of our members, Tess Weiss, who has an amazing story of how she lived through the Shoah and came to America, she was telling me about, she grew up at in Poland with the gymnasium where you learned Greek and you learned all the modern languages and you learned modern philosophy, but you were still also, traditionally Jewish. That was perfectly normal and acceptable before the war. World War II reshaped the way people remembered what life had been like before World War II. And so it's wrong to assume that it's only in America that assimilation was happening, or that only in America were people actually leaving Judaism. It was happening universally in Jewish communities where it was allowed. Once Jews were allowed to leave Judaism and were not required to join another faith to do so, many of the institutions of Europe were indeed driving Jews to leave. Which is one reason why I think the Reform movement, as much as I disagree with its early philosophy, was actually trying to keep Jews Jewish, despite many of the pressures that were pushing them out of the Jewish community of their day. But this is not a history class, this is a Mishnah class, and although we will certainly touch on history from time to time, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much to start.
What was interesting, Rabbi, and with this, we can move to Mishnah, I discovered a very strong connection that I didn't realize at the beginning between Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Akiva. The same ideas of the importance of the land of Israel, importance, the center of the Jewish people as a special relation with God over the rest, all the messianism and everything. That I didn't realize before how strong is the relationship between them.
Well, I mean, they had very similar circumstances in the sense that both of them felt that they were standing at the threshold of the rebirth of a Jewish state. And both of them, believed passionately. It's just that Rav Kook turned out to be right and Rabbi Akiva turned out to be wrong because of how history played out. But the feelings of the day were very, very similar. And we are very blessed to live in an era when it turns out that there is an independent Jewish state again. But had it gone the other way, had Israel, God forbid, had it lost its war for independence in 48, Rav Kook would have been seen as naive as Rabbi Akiva was in his day. Yeah, it's always tempting to think that the great people, whether it be Rambam, Mendelssohn, Akiva, Rav Kook, whoever, knew what was happening or were shaping the events, but oftentimes they were the voices that were powerful at the time, and whether they were successful or not was often out of their hands. And in the hands of all of us, in hands of the whole community and the global community. And that is something that we need to be humbled by and recognize that there is something to be said for, we're lucky to have any of these voices at all in our past, and many other voices that got silenced because history went a different direction. All right, back to Eruvin. We are in chapter 10, as I sort of hinted at last week. Chapter 10 is less specifically about Eruv itself, making the Shabbat boundaries or the rooms for carrying, and more an extension of Shabbat. Indeed, there are many who call Shabbat and Eruvin one Masechet, and that they're really, what we call Masechet Eruvin is just a digression from Shabbat as a general topic into the specific of Eruv. And then Eruvin 10 puts us back into sort of a generic discussion of Shabbat, still lingering on the topics of Eruvin to start, but moving further and further into general Shabbat topics. So it's kind of a summary of little topics at the end of this huge, long discussion that we've been in since the beginning of Shabbat about Shabbat in general. So let's talk. Chapter 10, Mishnah 1. One who finds tefillin. This is literally, you're walking through the city public road. There was no Eruv, so there was no carrying allowed, and you come across tefillin sitting there on the sidewalk. One who finds tefillin should bring them in one pair at a time. What is said here is that you can't carry, because we're talking about, again, on a public area, no carrying allowed. You can't carry them, but you can wear them, right? Tefillin are meant to be worn. Now, we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat usually, that is to say, ever, in a normal circumstance. But for the purposes of bringing them into safety, wearing them on Shabbat was allowed in this circumstance. Rabban Gamliel says, 2 pairs at a time. Now, he's arguing, yes, you can wear them, but you could even wear double tefillin in order to bring in 2 pairs from wherever they were abandoned at a time. Now, the other sages disagree, of course, because if you're wearing 2 at a time, you're not wearing them the way tefillin gets worn, which means really what you're doing is carrying them. So that seems to be moving back into the carrying problem. So that's why there was a disagreement on this.
From where came Rabbi Gamliel with 2 by 2 and not 3 by 3? Why 2 by 2?
There's room. There's room on the human body to comfortably wear 2 sets of tefillin. Right? If you try to wear more than that, then yeah, that's really going to be carrying them.
Why?
But,
you can have 4, 2 on the right, 2 on the left.
What happened to your head?
Okay.
You're not one of the angels in Ezekiel with four faces.
Yeah, I forgot the head. I was thinking about the hand.
You forgot about your head. Okay, so to what does this apply? To old ones. But in the cases of new ones, he is exempt, meaning you do not need to bring them. So old ones would clearly be tefillin. Old ones would clearly have the straps and be ready to be worn, whereas new ones, either A, were not prepared to be worn, they had not had the straps put on them and the knots tied, which you couldn't do on Shabbat, or they were not immediately identifiable as being actual kosher tefillin, and therefore you weren't allowed to move them because it might not be a valid tefillin. And similarly, if he found them arranged in a set or in bundles, he shall wait by them until it is dark and then bring them in, meaning if they are all tangled and it's impossible for him to untie them, because again, it's Shabbat, then the only thing he can do is sit and wait to keep them safe, right? That's how you're going to spend your Shabbat afternoon. You're waiting with the tefillin. In a time of danger, meaning either robbers or physical danger, he should cover them and walk away. If he's not feeling comfortable staying there because it's not a safe place, then put a little straw or something over the top of them, and that way they are now hidden, and then you can leave and stay safe until after Shabbat. Come back, grab them, and get them to safety and yourself too. Yes, Aaron. Aaron, you're muted if you're trying to talk.
Doesn't the Mishnah previously use the phrase "the time of danger" to mean after the Bar Kokhba revolt?
So it's in general, when you just see the word sakana, it's a more what's the right term? It's a more generic term for many different forms of danger. So yeah, this does not imply purely that, although it could certainly be a time when wearing tefillin would be punishable by the authorities, then definitely this would apply as well. All right, Mishnah 2. And again, yes.
When it says here to odd ones, means odd ones, yes, you can wear two at a time.
No. Old ones you have to bring in. New ones you do not.
So new ones you need to leave where it is. You cannot carry them.
Correct.
But why new ones? Yes, new ones are more expensive.
Spoken like a modern consumer.
No,
so,
but because new ones, like for example, new ones have more life ahead. And also the border for someone that invests so much money in the new ones is bigger, so it's more important, the value for the person.
So the main issue with regards to new ones was that they might not be prepared, meaning they didn't have the straps and the knots and everything done correctly. So therefore you couldn't wear them. They weren't wearable yet. The second issue was also was raised by the later sages is new tefillin and amulets were not always easy to tell apart, because sometimes people would make amulets in the shape of tefillin, and therefore it wasn't readily apparent. Apparently, old tefillin you could tell were actual tefillin, as opposed to amulets looking like tefillin. So the old tefillin, you were more confident that yes, these were legitimate, and yes, these you could wear. So it had less to do with the perceived value and more to do with either the perceived correctness or the potential to be able to be used. All right, now we have an alternative for taking care of these tefillin. Rabbi Shimon says he should pass them, meaning the tefillin, to his fellow, and his fellow should pass them to his fellow, and so on until they reach the outermost courtyard. Meaning you get a human chain, and they stand close enough that they're not more than 4 amot, 6 feet apart, so no social distancing. And one of them hands them to the other guy, and then that guy hands them to another guy, and they just use the chain to move it all the way into a safe place. Because neither of them or none of them are moving it more than that 4 amot at once, no one person is actually breaking the halacha. And this allows them to move it into a safe place. And the same is true in the case of his child. he passes him to his fellow, and his fellow passes him to his fellow, and so on, even if there are 100 people. Now, everybody, the commentaries all agree that either option would be correct with regards to the tefillin, right? You can wear it or you can pass it. In both cases, that could be sufficient. Rabbi Judah says one may pass a jar to his fellow, and his fellow may pass it to his fellow, even beyond the Shabbat limit, right? Even beyond the Tehum, beyond the boundary beyond which we don't normally walk. However, he loses this argument. They say to him, this must not go further than the feet of its owner. Meaning, if I, the owner of the jar, can't walk past the Tehum, then my property, even with this human conveyor belt, can't go past the boundary either. Because objects take on the location of their owner. Okay, Mishnah 3. Like I said, we've got a lot of Mishnayot to get through. In fact, this one won't even fit on one page. All right, we're just going to have to leave the Hebrew for those to look them up if they want, but otherwise I can't get all the English up for those watching, and I think the majority of my audience is reading the English. If one was reading a scroll, meaning, remember, all books back in the day were written on scrolls. They didn't have convenient bound books like we do. And on a threshold, so you're reading this like on your porch, and the scroll rolled out of his hand, meaning one half of the scroll. So you're still holding on to part of it, but the rest of it is now tumbled out of your hands and out into the public domain. He may roll it back to himself. So he's still holding on to part of it. The rest has gone into the public domain. He can roll it back so that the public domain part comes back into his property. Now, if he had let go of it and the whole thing had gone out in the public domain, now he'd be in trouble because carrying it back in would be a problem. Similarly, if he was reading on the top of a roof and the scroll rolled from his hand, meaning he's holding part and the other part has gone over the edge of the roof, before it reached 10 handbreadths from the ground, he may roll it back to himself, back up the building. Because remember, from 10 tefachim and down is considered the public domain. And so once it enters that airspace, then it's considered to be in the public domain. But after, hold on, let's just finish the but. But after it had reached 10 handbreadths from the ground, he must turn it over with the writing downwards. This was intended, if it was a holy book, to keep it from being disrespected by covering the writing, basically by turning the back of the scroll to the street. Yes, Natan.
Because my first association is a Torah. Okay, you are reading a Torah at home and fell apart. Okay,
right.
So in case that accident happened, is there any special blessing? Because the Torah was not desecrated, but not treated fairly. Okay, let's put that way. You don't say any bless, anything, any.
No. As a matter of fact, one of the things that a lot of people seem to know in Judaism is what happens if a Torah falls to the ground. What do?
You fast, the community.
Right.
7 days.
You will never find that in the Mishnah or the Talmud. Right? Everybody knows that if the Torah falls, that there has to be a big fast. But there's actually no halakha that says that. It is a very strong custom and a very good one. I can talk another day about why they came up with that particular custom and how it's been implemented when it does get implemented. But there actually is no special response to when a Torah falls to the ground. In this particular case, if you were reading from the Torah and it rolled off into the street, yes, you should be very regretful. And yes, you should be very upset that you have allowed the Torah to be treated in this manner. But there is no particular punishment, and there is no particular tikkun, no special remedy for this particular action. In general, the idea of there always being a special tikkun, a mystical prayer to be said or action to be taken, is a relatively new concept in Judaism.
New for you is from Tosafot, or really new, like from the last 200 years?
So new in the sense that there are glimpses of it in the Kabbalah from about 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, and then it begins to pick up steam throughout the Middle Ages, and then really gets going about 300 years ago. And then, of course, with Hasidism, it just explodes. The idea that there's a tikkun for everything. Rabbi Judah says, even if it was removed from the ground by no more than a thread's thickness, he may roll it back to himself. So Rabbi Judah says, look, if it hasn't actually contacted the ground, then even though it's in that space, it's still anchored in the private domain of the roof, and therefore it still has the status of the roof and can be brought back up.
It's a good point.
Rabbi Shimon says, even if it touched the actual ground, he may roll it back to himself, since no prohibition that is due to Shabbat rest stands before the holy writings. So Rabbi Shimon's position is that, look, even if it's on the ground, even if it's joined the new public domain, I still can roll it back up, because to do otherwise would be letting holy writings be potentially degraded. And so that's got to be more important than the shvut, the special prohibition on not transgressing this moving from one domain to another in these marginal cases. It's important to note, Rabbi Shimon loses this argument, meaning that actually the shvut is protected, and we do turn the text over, and we would wait until after Shabbat to fully recover it.
But yes, I was thinking that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda was kind of consistent with the laws of Shabbat. When you remember when we learn about what happens, someone pass and fruit or something from one field to the other, depending if your body are completely in one side to the private or to the public. And we say that it's okay if most of your body is in the private and you pass and fruit, or you take something from the public, and that's okay. So it's not the same idea with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon with the scroll. If most of the scroll is in the private and only one little part, like our hands, is in the public, should be also okay. It's the same idea, huh?
But this is not, it's similar, but this is not about the location of the person, which we will talk about actually a little bit later on. This is talking about the location of an item.
Correct, but the scroll, the location of the scroll cannot take the same connotation as the location of the person.
Exactly. Right. People and items have different standing in Jewish law.
Oh, okay. So you cannot apply the same logic for objects.
Not directly, no.
Also, they are holy ones.
Yes. So yes, in worst case, if it absolutely fell out of your hands and rolled into the public domain, the best you could do would be to turn it at least upside down so it didn't get ruined or degraded by the things walking back and forth nearby, and of course stay with it to protect it, but you wouldn't be allowed to move it back in to the private domain. All right, Mishnah 4. If there was a ledge in front of a window, it is permitted to put objects on it or to remove objects from it on Shabbat. So in this case, we're talking about like a sort of like a window box where you might have the ledge hovering out over into the public domain, but it's high enough that it's not in the public domain. So, imagine your window is a good 4 feet up on the wall, right? 1.5 meters. So you have a ledge outside. Does that ledge become its own domain? No, it's an extension of the inner domain of the house, and I can put something on the ledge and remove it from the ledge. and it's not a problem. Or perhaps it's even what's called a Carmelite in its own status. But the important thing is I can move back and forth from that little space there in and from here out from onto that ledge. A man may stand in a private domain and move objects in a public domain, or he may stand in a public domain and move objects in a private domain, provided he does not take them beyond 4 cubits. So to go back to
the previous one with the Torah rolling.
So to go back into your question, right? I'm standing in one domain and I'm leaning out into the other domain. I can move things in that domain, but I cannot move them from that domain into my domain. So I could lean into your house window and I could move the salt and pepper inside your house, but I couldn't take your salt and pepper out of the house. And I couldn't move it more than 4 cubits inside your house.
Rabbi.
Yes.
You said it was Carmelite, potentially, the
shelf. Yes.
Shelf. I thought you couldn't take from Carmelite to the to either the public or private. I thought you just weren't liable for moving from Carmelite to the public or private.
Correct, in the general sense, but this is a nebulous case because of its attachment as part of the window. So it sort of exists in its own little twilight zone. Okay, number 5. We have 14 to go, so don't worry, we got plenty more. A man may not stand in a private domain and urinate in a public domain, or in a public domain and urinate in a private domain. And similarly, he may not spit, meaning cross domains. So you might think that transferring only matters when you're carrying it with your hands, but if you are throwing it, expelling it from your body, whether it be from your mouth or lower down, that is still prohibited. You cannot cross the domain in this manner either. Yes, Natan.
Rabbi, if I remember correctly from a Secret Shabbat, you could do it if you keep in the same domain. For example, if you go for one place and you scoop and you pee to the other area, but it's over 10 bread hands. What is
hand breadths? Hand breadths.
Still, you are on the private domain, so they were okay. I remember the example of throwing a ball. They say if you can throw something from one domain to the other, and in the middle is a public domain, that's okay. So maybe if you can pee and you pee like on the wall that is over 10 bread hands, what is it?
Hand breadths. Hand breadth.
Hand breadths. Over 10 hand breadths.
Tefachim.
Still, you are under a private domain. So it's private over private. Why you cannot?
Okay, so if I understand the example you're trying to give, if a person urinates from one private domain into another private domain, is that what you're saying? Or inside their own private domain?
Mm-hmm.
So of course you're allowed to urinate in your own private domain. It's called going to the bathroom.
Yeah, like I mean to something else. Like I don't know, an example. Let's say you come from private domain and there's a street and there's an house in the other side and they're very close. So why you cannot urinate from one house to the other if they are over Arba Fahot?
Right. So if
private.
If you have an eruv with the other person, so you're allowed to transfer from your property to their property, then yes, as we looked at earlier, you can transfer from one property to the other. However, I should point out that urinating over a street when there are people walking below and you're urinating into your neighbor's house, even if it is technically allowed, it's not a good idea. It's not a good neighborly action.
But technically, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just don't tell your neighbors, the rabbi said this is fine. And the same, of course, with spitting. Now, Rabbi Yehuda adds a stringency. He says, even when a person's spit accumulated in his mouth, he must not walk 4 cubits before he spat it out. Now, he doesn't win the argument, but he was considering that if inside your mouth, your spit has sort of detached itself from the cheeks, and you can actually feel it like loose in your mouth, that you would have to spit it out before you continued to walk, or else it'd be like you were carrying it in your mouth. Now, he loses that argument. Our bodily fluids are considered part of us until they leave us, but that was his position. All right, so now we get more about leaning from one domain to another. This time it's about drinking in rather than letting out. A man may not stand in a private domain and drink in the public domain, or stand in the public domain or drink in a private domain, unless he puts his head and the greater part of his body into the domain in which he drinks. And similarly concerning a wine press. So if you want to drink from a domain that you're not physically standing in, you can lean into it, drink, and that would make the liquid go into you and join your body. And then when you come back, the liquid is in you, it's part of your body. So it doesn't count as moving it because now it is in you. Everyone follow that logic? The rabbis were definitely concerned as well that if you were doing this, you might have to be careful that people don't bring their cups back into the other zone, because moving the cup would definitely be a problem. A man may intercept water from a gutter, meaning off the roof of the house, at a level below 10 handbreadths. And from a water spout, he may drink in any manner. So what the rabbis are trying to say here is if there's a gutter and the gutter is dropping water off the roof of the house, you have to make sure that the water has become detached from the gutter. It's now falling free before you drink from it. You can't just and I know this may sound weird, you can't put your mouth up on the gutter and drink directly from it on Shabbat, because the gutter is considered to be part of the roof domain. And so you would be transferring directly from one domain to another. But once it's detached, it's no longer part of the upper domain. And now it is basically what's called a makom patur. It's just in a null zone. And therefore you can drink from there. A spout, on the other hand, which sticks out from the building, so it's further away from the roof, so it becomes its own null domain. You can do whatever you want because it is already detached from the roof. Just by the way it's constructed, the water is no longer connected to the roof. Therefore, you can drink from it straight from the spigot if you want. I do not recommend this, however. Please do not drink directly from your roof water unless you are very, very desperate.
Now, in order to drink from the gutter, you need to be sure that it's going but tipa, like a
drop by drop, yeah.
Drop by drop. Okay, if it's drop by drop, it's like the same idea of the I forgot. I forgot. Okay, you need to have a continuous flow of water. If it's interrupted, it's okay.
Right. Exactly. And if it's away from the building, meaning that spout, that would also make it okay. All right, Mishnah 7. I told you these are a nice collection of different concepts. If a cistern, right? Remember, this is like the chamber used to hold water. If a cistern in a public domain had an embankment 10 handbreadths high, which basically would mean that the chamber holding the water is now considered its own private domain, separate from the public domain. It is permitted to draw water from it on Shabbat through a window above it. And remember, we talked about this idea of pulling up water from one area through the air into another area. And this is trying to say that if the cistern has this kind of embankment along the side, like a hill around it, then that makes it its own space, and then it's allowed to do this. Same thing, but the opposite direction. If a garbage heap in a public domain was 10 handbreadths high, it is permitted to pour water onto it on Shabbat from a window above. Because it is 10 handbreadths high, it becomes its own space, and therefore it is not connected to the public space, and you are allowed to access it through this air window. Aaron.
How come sometimes you can access Carmelite and sometimes you can't?
Because the laws of Eruvin are incredibly complicated.
Oh.
I mean, it's really as simple as that and as complicated as that.
But shouldn't there be some kind of reasoning behind it? I mean, I'd like to think that the laws weren't made at random.
No, it's not necessarily made at random. I mean, in this particular case, the idea is that you are transferring, if you will, through this null zone of the air in between. You're not moving into a domain. You're moving from one domain into a null domain, from the null domain into your domain.
But isn't that what Carmelite is all the time? It's like a null domain or an in-between domain, they call it?
Well, the Carmelite is like that, but then there is the other null domain of like the air that is not connected to anything, which has its own null status, the makom patur.
So this is not Carmelite then when it's 10 handbreadths above. It's something else?
It would be its own domain.
But isn't that Carmelite or no?
Depends on how big it is.
Oh.
It's its overall space.
So
if you expect to get all of this just from our very superficial discussion of Eruvin, even though it's taken us weeks, yeah, there's a lot more to study. Now, if you want to get on the Talmud bandwagon, the Masechet Eruvin just began, and that will give you a very thorough grounding in all of this in much more detail than we've had time to do.
All right.
All right, let's create another new territory. If a tree overshadows the ground, so imagine the branches are hanging down. If its branches are not higher than 3 handbreadths from the ground, it is permitted to carry underneath it. Meaning where the branches come down, they make like a dome in the area. And between the bottom of the branches and the ground, there's only 3 handbreadths or less. Then under the principle that we call lavud, it becomes as though it were joined to the ground. And that means then that it is its own territory underneath. You've made a little tree house, a tree umbrella. And that makes like a building out of the shape of the tree. Everyone get the picture? And since it's around and settled, moving things around inside of it, that's fine. If its roots are 3 handbreadths high, meaning the roots of the tree stick up from the ground 3 handbreadths or more, so again, we're talking about 12 inches here, about 1/3 of a meter, one may not sit on them because now they are part of the tree and not part of the ground. And as we know, using a tree on Shabbat is prohibited. You can use the ground, but you can't use the tree. Different topic. So I want to make sure everyone's got this first. Everyone okay on the tree? Not seeing any problems. With the door in the muktzah. All right, just to make life confusing, this is a different meaning of muktzah than we've talked about before. Right? This muktzah is the backyard shed where you keep stuff that's cheap and unimportant. Think your firewood shack. And the door to it usually wasn't a proper door. It was the kind of thing you would lift up and set to one side and then put back when you were done. So the door would almost be just sort of leaning over the hole that was the opening into the shack. With the door to the muktzah and the thorns in a breach of a wall, meaning that people, if there was a hole in the wall, they would often just shove in a bunch of thorns to keep like animals and things from crawling through, and reed mats, which were these extra just reed mats that people used. One may not close an opening unless they are high off the ground. The issue here was that it appeared when you would put this door from the muktzah or the thorns or whatever on Shabbat, it would appear that you were actually building rather than merely closing, right? closing the door to my bedroom is perfectly fine on Shabbat. Building a door on my bedroom is not okay on Shabbat. But what's the difference between closing the door and building a door? Well, the real difference in this particular case, because a lot of doors, even for regular houses, were just like these doors. The real difference is, does it look like a door? Does it feel like a door? Does it walk like a door? Does it quack like a door? So if people could tell this was a door and being used just as a door, not being used as a building component to the muktzah or the wall or anything else, then by all means, go ahead and use it. And the standard way of telling that was if it was higher up. It wasn't just dragging on the ground, but was put into position that was door-like. That is the general rule that they seem to be implying here. Aaron.
Hey, sorry to keep asking questions, but
No, questions are good. I'm sorry that I can't always spend as much time as needed to answer all of them.
in Shabbat, wasn't one of the main difference is whether or not the difference between building a door and shutting a door was whether or not it improved the property. So when you build a door, you're actually improving and attaching something, where if you're shutting a door, you're kind of just using stuff that's already there.
Correct. And that's why these cases are marginal cases about whether or not they actually count as one of the improving types of door that wasn't really part of it to begin with, or whether it's just, it was kind of already here to begin with, and so we're not really improving it, we're just closing it.
Right. So this is more similar to the chicken and cheese, right?
The Marit Ayin, the appearance issue.
Yeah.
Yes. Because these are not, these are items that could easily be mistaken for building. Yes.
And what happened with the state of the door? You have a curtains.
You have a what?
You have, I don't know, something not so permanent. 1 second.
Like a temporary door?
Yeah, temporary or 1 second. I'm trying to think, like sheet. Like you have a sheet or something that like when you cover the bed.
Like a curtain.
Yeah, like a curtain or something like that.
Right.
Can you use this as a door? Like can that work as a mixer?
Oh, of course you can use it. The question is that was it already in place before Shabbat? I mean, a curtain usually has like a rod and it's attached. And you can slide it open and close, no problem on Shabbat, but you couldn't attach it on Shabbat.
And what if you hang it over the place? I don't know, you have a beam or something over the place, temporary. It's nothing fixed. Can you do that?
If you have like if you have something that normally goes up and down, like your patio umbrella, right? That sometimes you put the umbrella up and sometimes you have it down. You can open and close that on Shabbat, but you couldn't build that kind of umbrella on Shabbat, and you couldn't like make a little tent on Shabbat. You couldn't just say, I'm going to put a pole and I'm going to hang a sheet over it on Shabbat. If it's already there, sure.
I was thinking, you see that the pole that people do exercise, hanging it and do some exercise like hanging,
right?
Like this is permanent, but you decide to pull over there's a curtain or something there, okay, to divide two areas using already what you have there fixed.
Gotcha. So you just want to hang up a cloth.
Can you create exactly? Can you create a door, or you can use as a mixer?
So in that particular case, the issue would be more about building an ohel, building a tent. That if you wanted to hang your clothes on a rod, sure, no problem. And if you wanted to hang a large piece of clothing so that it made like a barrier across the doorway, no problem. Hanging a sheet over it to make a doorway, as long as you're not making an area underneath it that would be considered a space, like an ohel, a tent, then that's fine. So, if you're just hanging up your sheet, which is on a coat hanger, that's okay.
Because you are creating a door, a physical door to divide two areas. So what is the definition of creating a door? If door is something to divide two areas, you are doing in that way.
Right. So remember, Jewish law doesn't go by the sort of logical positivism of what is the definition of, and then what fills that definition, right? Judaism says this counts as, this doesn't count as, and then we apply those case examples as best we can to new cases that appear. I know it's something that has been very frustrating for many students of Jewish law for a long time. It doesn't usually like to reduce it to simple phrases and formulas. The Mishnah would rather give us 100 examples than one definition. And that's just a general pattern of how Jewish law gets written. It comes to the Talmud to try and give us a bit more definition, and then later codifiers, but then they end up having to argue about those definitions. All right, I want to press on, I'm afraid. Let's see. A man may not stand in a private domain and open the door in a public domain, or in a public domain and open the door in a private domain, unless he has made a partition 10 handbreadths high. The words of Rebbe Meir. So I'm standing on the street, I unlock the door, and I push it open into the private domain. That's a problem, unless there is a little partition around me and the door, creating a shared space. Shared space, no problem. Separate spaces, it's a problem, right? Because this is going to involve me moving not just the door, but me moving the key, and more than likely me taking the key back with me. Which is why they say to him, it happened at the oxen or chicken fatteners market in Jerusalem, that they would lock their shops and leave the key in a window above a shop door, meaning that closing the door was fine, and then they would put the key just right above it, so it was always in the same area. And Rabbi Yossi disagrees only about the location. It was the wool dealers market where they used to do this, not the fatteners market. All right, doors are good. But let's talk about their locks. Again, remember, in the ancient world, and even in the classical world of the Mishnah, people did not have beautiful brass locks with delicate little keys and bolts sliding in and out and all of that. Most people had a door where you would take a piece of wood and you'd shove it through a hole as your lock. All right? If you were really lucky, you might have a piece of metal that you would turn that would sort of push it into place. And only the very wealthy had like fancy little bars and things. So a bolt, meaning the peg, the rod that you're using to lock your door, which has a knob at one end. And this is separate from the door. It's a separate item. Rabbi Eliezer forbids it, meaning to be moved. Rabbi Yossi permits it, meaning Rabbi Eliezer says, look, this thing is just building the door, right? You're completing the door with it when you use it to shove it into place. Rabbi Yossi says, no, it's got a knob at the end. This can be used for other purposes. It's not only for that. So therefore, I should be allowed to still move it. Rabbi Eliezer said it happened in a synagogue in Tiberias that they were customary to permit it, meaning they would normally carry this thing around until Rabban Gamliel and the elders came and forbade it to them. Rabbi Yossi says they treated it as forbidden. Rabban Gamliel and the elders came and permitted it to them. So this is a great example, and I'm going to leave you for the Talmud just because of time to see how it gets resolved, of two different sources, each claiming the same thing happened, but reversing the implication. One says it was okay, and then they ruled it out, and the other says they didn't used to do it, and then they said it was okay. Same people, same situation, two different traditions. Like I said, I'll leave it for those who are in the Daf Yomi to wait until they get to the end of Eruvin to see how it gets worked out, because it's more complicated than we have time for tonight, because I really want to finish tonight. On to our door bolt number 2, a bolt that drags along the ground. This would be another bolt rod that you use for locking the door, wedging it in place, but this time it's hanging from a rope and it's dragging on the ground when you open the door and when you close the door. So it's part of the door because of the rope, but not exactly. And now we're going to get a very interesting introduction, which is sort of going to take us to the end of the Mishnah. It is permitted to lock a door with it in the temple, but not in the country. Meaning that if you are in the temple precincts, it's okay. But if you're not in the temple precincts, but anywhere else in Jewish world, it's not okay. This is introducing us to the idea that anything that is prohibited as a shvut, that magic word meaning an extra precaution that the rabbis instituted just in case you did bop, 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 just in case you built with it, just in case you broke a stick, just in case you went swimming or built a flotation device, those types of prohibitions, those don't apply inside the temple. In the temple, it is Torah only. Outside the temple, the additional rabbinic prohibitions are in place. But one that rests on the ground, meaning a peg that's just sitting on the ground 100%, not dangling off anything, it's just sitting there, both here and here, meaning in the temple and outside the temple, it is forbidden to use it. Rabbi Judah says, one that rests on the ground is permitted in the temple, but one that drags on the ground is permitted even in the country. So he's more lenient, and he says that the positioning on the ground one, that is allowed in the temple because it's a shvut, and therefore in the temple it's okay, but in the rest of the country it isn't. But everybody would agree that the dangling one is definitely part of the door, and so that's not a shvut permission or prohibition. That is absolutely allowed anywhere you go. In that same vein, I want to continue this topic before I try to explain any more of it. A lower hinge of a door may be reinserted in the temple. So doors were often made of rather flimsy construction, and the hinges would often pop loose. If the bottom hinge comes loose, you can reinsert it. You can put it back in place if you are in the temple, but not in the country. Meaning that normally you would never touch it, but technically the door is still intact as long as the upper hinge is in place. And so pushing the bottom one back into place technically is not building. However, the rabbi said, don't touch it. But since the rabbi said that as an additional fence within the temple precinct, that fence doesn't apply. The upper one, of course, is forbidden in both places, meaning both in the temple area as well as in the rest of the world. Rabbi Yehuda says the upper one may be reinserted in the temple and the lower one in the country. He, again, is more lenient on this point. We good? We following the logic-ish? Okay, we're almost there. 13. Again, before I get into this, just a reminder, the rabbis had a different understanding of medicine in the ancient world than we do now. Right? Nowadays, we understand what types of medicines are effective for most types of illnesses and procedures. In the ancient world, medicine was pretty much a, maybe it'll help. Sometimes they thought it might, sometimes they thought it wouldn't. In general, it made that the use of medicine, which often involved Shabbat violations, such as tying, grinding, and other things, something the rabbis generally said we don't do on Shabbat. In the modern world, we do use medicine on Shabbat because we are assured that the medicine we are using indeed has a curative effect. So, in their day, one may replace a bandage on a wound in the temple, but not in the country. So in the temple, you would often need to have your hand completely exposed so that there was nothing between you and the implements and the sacrifice that you were making. Now, if you have a wound, obviously in the modern world, you should probably stay away from slaughtering animals, but in the temple, they didn't quite have that same medical understanding. If you have a wound, you would have a bandage on it normally, and you would take it off, and then you would do the service, and then you would put it on. And the rabbis allowed this to be done in the temple because they didn't want the priests to avoid doing the services just because they had a problem with their hand. At the outset, however, it is prohibited in both, meaning that if you get a wound, you cannot put a new bandage on from scratch, either in the temple or outside, as this would be considered work on Shabbat. Again, this does not mean how we practice today. Today, if you have an injury that needs to be properly treated, by all means, drive to the hospital, do whatever necessary, go to the ER, it's perfectly fine. A harp string may be tied up in the temple, but not in the country. At the outset, meaning from the beginning, of course, if you're fixing one, but if you're actually making an instrument, it is prohibited in both. And similarly, one may remove a wart in the temple, but not in the country. If the operation must be performed with an instrument, it is forbidden in both, meaning you have to use some alternative way. And don't get too grossed out. The general ideas are, scraping it off with finger or teeth. Welcome to the ancient world. They were not quite so squeamish. Indeed, there are some that argue that this removal was actually removing a bit from an animal that was a blemish. So if you can just imagine biting the wart off of a cow, yes, it was a different world. A priest who was wounded in his finger may wrap some reed grass round it in the temple, but not in the country. Again, this was to allow a protective barrier, this time on the back, usually of the hand, in order to allow him to still do the service. But of course, you wouldn't do that outside the temple. But if he intended to draw out blood, it is forbidden in both cases. Right? So the issue here is that causing a wound was prohibited. And there were times when people thought it was beneficial to make the blood come out. And so that they're pointing out should not be done in this case. Additionally, they didn't want to use something that was an actual cloth bandage in the temple precincts because that would be considered adding to the priestly clothing. The priests could only wear that which the Torah said they could wear, and including and up to bandages. They scatter salt on the altar's ramp so that the priests shall not slip, which is not allowed elsewhere because it's considered improvement of the item. They draw water by means of a wheel on Shabbat from the cistern of the exiles and from the great cistern, which were specific wells, and on a festival day from the Hakar cistern, which was another well that was needed for the additional water necessary for all of the pilgrims that came for the festival. In this case, they generally did not want people drawing with a wheel, which would make the drawing of the water much easier, because they were worried that if drawing the water was too easy, that people would draw water and water their gardens, rather than only using the water for the minimum needs of Shabbat. And our final Mishnah, if a dead creepy thing, or creepy crawly, as my Mishnah teacher used to call them, was found in the temple, a creepy crawly, a sheretz, is something that will create ritual impurity, so it had to be gotten rid of, but getting rid of it could mean you become ritually impure. A priest should carry it out in his girdle, his belt, in order not to keep the impurity there any longer than necessary. The words of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Rabbi Yehuda says it should be removed with wooden tongs in order that uncleanliness should not increase, right? So here's the two options. One, you see the dead lizard, so you take your belt, you wrap it around it, you keep it in the belt becomes impure, but the belt does not make you impure, and now you can remove it. On the other hand, you go looking for wooden tongs because the wooden tongs do not become impure, and you use them to pick it up and move it. The first case, you get rid of it fast, but you add to the impurity because now the belt is impure. The second case, you get rid of it slowly because you have to look for the tongs, but you don't make anything else impure in the process. Everyone follow the two cases? Right, Rabbi Yehuda happens to win this one. From where must it be removed? Meaning, how far away do you take it? What counts as away when you're getting rid of this thing? From the sanctuary, from the hall, and from between the hall and the altar, the words of Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. Rabbi Akiva says, from any place where karet is incurred for entering unintentionally, and a sin offering, a chatat, for entering in error, from there it must be removed, and from any other place, they cover it with a large pot. So he has a slightly larger area that we need to get rid of this thing. And even outside that area, if it's still within the temple, the broader temple courtyard spaces, you would cover it to make sure it didn't get in contact or move any place that could cause more trouble. And then we get our final statement to all of Eruvin, which is something I've been trying to say, but of course, Rabbi Shimon says it better than me. Wherever the sages have permitted you anything, they have only given you what is really yours, since they have only permitted you that which is forbidden as shvut. Right? In case you think the sages are being lenient, in case you think they are letting you break Torah, in case you think the sages are giving you permission to do something that should be forbidden, they are not. They set fences that are outside what is the original core prohibition in order to protect the core prohibition, which is right and proper. But when it's necessary to step across that barrier, they're only stepping across into an area which is still not part of the core prohibition. So when they say it is okay to carry with an eruv, as the whole example of the Masechet might be describing, they're not giving you permission to do something the Torah said don't. They're giving you permission to do something that, according to the Torah, you have permission to do, but which the rabbis, to protect you and the community, had said don't. So when they give leniencies, when they create eruv altogether, when they do all of the discussions in this whole Masechet, they are giving you back in pieces here and there permission to do something that you technically already had permission to do, but maybe not the wisdom to do correctly. When we talk about the creation then of an eruv as a blanket area for a city, that is something to keep in mind. That a lot of people I know have complained, oh, but if there's an eruv, then it's like no one even cares about carrying anymore. It's like you're trampling the Torah, blah, 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 blah. Like, no, you are using the permission the rabbis gave you to work within their own system. You're not even getting close to stepping on the Torah itself. All right, so questions, final thoughts on Eruvin. Like I promised, next week we will look at how to make a modern eruv, or rather, how modern Eruvin are made, and what concept and theories are behind it. Now, I've only gotten one strong vote for the next Masechet, which was Ta'anit. I'm happy to hear from other people if you have other suggestions in the meantime, but otherwise, that's what we will be doing next. All right, everyone, take care, be well, keep studying, and pat yourself on the back for our completion of Eruvin. And if you feel like you didn't understand everything that happened, good. That means you're actually paying attention. And it means there's still more to learn, and you should always look forward to learning more.
Now we need to eat a feast to celebrate the completion of the Masechet.
I would love to have a siyum together and have the that feast of completion, but we'll have to save that for when it's a little bit more opportune.
Thank you for the shiur, Rabbi Yeshakor.
All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye bye.